Hello Fast Fam, thanks for tuning in. I'm Craig Lieberman and I've been tinkering on cars since 1980. I've owned more than 40 cars in my life. Some were heroes, some were zeros. But never in my wildest dreams would I ever guess that 3 of my cars would go on to star in a motion picture franchise. My Supra, my GTR, and my Maxima all had starring roles in Universal's Fast and Furious movies. Over the next 3 years, I'd served Universal as a technical advisor. I helped choose the cars, procure the parts, oversee their builds, and support both production and post-production. I have some cool stories to tell about what it was like to build these cars and to work with the cast. I was there, on set, in the production meetings, working on cars, hanging with the actors, and consulting on post-production. So follow along as I tell the stories. Let's jump in. It's time to talk about some good old American muscle. We're talking about a 9-second tire fryer with 900 screaming horses of thigh-slapping, blood-pumping nuclear brain damage. So what if a car like this costs as much as some people's homes? You can't drive your house to the drag strip, right? Dom's Charger gave muscle car guys a stiffy the moment it made its first appearance. Few things are more satisfying than an alcohol-injected, fire-breathing, supercharged big block with a giant bug catcher hood scoop that'll suck the paint off your house and give your family a permanent orange afro. For many people, it's Mopar or no car. This is arguably the most iconic car of the franchise, in no small part because Dom has been repeatedly seen in one type of Dodge B-body or another in several of the movies. For those who don't already know, the B-body designation includes 1966 to 1978 Dodge Chargers, Dodge Cornettes, Plymouth Belvederes, Plymouth Satellites, and Plymouth GTXs. In the first movie, we used a 1970 Charger, although it did have some parts from a 1969 Charger. The story of this car, though, is a bit confusing. We had 4 or 5 of these Chargers for use in the movie. The exact number is unknown because the cars were all built by a shop that Universal had contracted with beforehand. The shop was called Cinema Vehicle Services. This meant that the Picture Car Warehouse had very little to do with the Chargers. They were largely controlled by Second Unit, which is the unit that is responsible for doing the stunts. Essentially, there was 1 hero car and 3 stunt cars. This is largely because the Chargers were used predominantly for stunts. And there were many stunts, if you remember, including the Johnny Tran chase sequence. The Hero 1 car was the one that had the big supercharged engine in it, but don't let Hollywood fool you, that car never actually drove with that big engine in it. The engine we used was actually borrowed for this scene in Toretto's garage. This is the scene where Dom reveals the car to Brian, and we're treated to a short close-up of the engine. That particular engine came from a place called Chuck Taylor Racing Engines out in the Midwest of the USA and was used only for that shot. Once we got that shot, that engine was pulled out of the car and shipped straight back to Chuck Taylor Racing Engines. The engine was built using a 1957-58 model 392 Hemi, which is bored and stroked to 445 cubic inches, although one source said it was a 572 cubic inch engine. It was alcohol injected using mechanical fuel injection. It had a Krager intake manifold, a Mooneyham 671 supercharger, and an Enderley 3-inch hat spacer and an Enderley buzzard catcher scoop sticking out of the hood. The car also had long tube headers and, as I recall, Flowmaster mufflers. The interior was stripped down and featured some aluminum door panels and a roll cage. Wheels were the very popular Krager 200S Max. The car doesn't appear again until the end of the film. At this point, Jesse has just been shot, and Dom decides to go in pursuit of Johnny Tran. At last, we finally hear that glorious motor start up and accelerate away. The sound is absolutely intoxicating. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll cream your jeans. One thing about the sounds used in the movie for this car, they were faked. You can tell because there's a very distinctive whine produced by the supercharger, and that whine is absent in the soundtrack of the movie. While the car we recorded was indeed a big block Hemi, it wasn't supercharged, so another boyhood dream has been crushed. Sorry about that. As for the Hero 2 and the stunt cars, they used a standard Dodge engine, but there is a bit of confusion as to whether or not they were all 383s or 440s. Stunt car number 2 is the one that did the pipe ramp jump over the front of the semi. This car appeared at a Mecum auction featuring a 440 cubic inch engine, but no word on whether or not this was the engine used during the pipe jump. In case you haven't already figured it out, the stunt cars did not have real superchargers sticking out of the hoods. In fact, replica blowers were fabricated and mounted to a panel attached to the bottom of the hood. If you watch closely, you'll see the supercharger's drive belt is not spinning. That's a dead giveaway. I've done a whole video on this before, so I'll be brief about this. Invariably, the question of who would have really won comes up all the time. Anyone who knows anything about drag racing knows that traction means everything. In this case, Dom's Charger had racing slicks and supposedly made 900 horsepower. I know how much my Supra made it, and even with the nitrous system, it would still have a 200 horsepower deficit against the Charger. The Supra was also heavier than the Charger, as my car had a full interior and a sound system, and the Charger was a stripped shell, no carpeting, no door panels, no trunk, interior, and so on. In fact, the stock 1970 Dodge Charger weighs about 3,200 pounds, which is about the same as a 1994 Toyota Supra Turbo. The now famous wheelie wasn't actually real. Anyone who knows anything about drag racing knows that if you're doing a wheelie, it's because your car is hooking up and traction isn't a problem. You don't do a wheelie and smoke the tires. So to pull this off on camera, we installed hydraulic wheelie bars that were pointing forward underneath the car. The smoke then came from a smoke machine and some CG. Therefore, it should have been no contest, and the Charger should have wasted the Supra, except, as we see in the movie, the Charger suddenly has engine problems. The movie seems to show it kicking a rod out of the side of the block, and that should have been it. Race would have been over, and he would have coasted to a stop. Instead, what does Dom do? He upshifts to yet another gear and stands on the throttle.
Bullshit, bullshit, bullshit.
As they near the finish line, somehow they're still neck and neck. Thanks to 2 launch ramps set up for the cars, both cars become airborne, as they just missed being hit by what was actually an imaginary train. The train, of course, was dubbed in later and shot separately from this shot. So just as the producers wanted, neither car had a clear advantage at the finish. To be clear, it was essentially a tie. It meant only that the 2 drivers were now at least equals. Of course, none of this matters because in the next second, Dom hits the front of a semi. More artistic liberties are taken by the production team as the Charger, instead of plowing into the front of the semi, it suddenly launches up and over it. This is an old Hollywood gag, and it uses a pipe ramp to get the Charger up in the air. Essentially, an inclined piece of pipe is bolted to the ground, and on cue, the stunt driver aims for the pipe ramp with the goal of hitting it in just the right spot. The result is that the car is launched into the air and flips over. Of course, the problem with this is that the landing is wildly unpredictable. For this particular stunt, Tim Trello was a stunt driver, and by all accounts, he was a genius. As you saw in the movie, the Charger hits the pipe ramp perfectly, and it lands in such a way that you can't tell the Supercharger was fake. Once the car lands, the director yells cut. They then stuck Vin Diesel into the car and complete the scene. Of course, after this movie wrapped, this car went back to the Cinema Vehicle Services along with the rest of the Chargers. And here's what we know about the breakdown of the cars and where they are now. The Process Buck car was a 1970 model. This is the car in which Vin Diesel rode as he was next to Paul in the drag race scene. Stunt 3 was the wheelie car and was a 1969 model. Stunt 2 was the jump car and was also a 1970 model. Stunt 1 was the car that knocked the motorcycle rider off the road, and Universal still has that car. That car is probably a 1970 model. The Hero 1 car was the garage scene car. This car has changed hands a couple of times and now resides in Italy. And that's going to wrap it up. Hopefully I answered all your questions about the Dodge Chargers, and I hope that you love and appreciate these cars as much as all the other Fast and Furious fans. Thanks for watching, everybody. Be sure to tune in next time, and please subscribe. See you next time.